rememberthecommands.com. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about Exodus 23:13. Are we to not mention the names of other Elohim, or are we to not invoke the names of other Elohim? Is it mention or is it invoke? This is a reevaluation of my past position on the subject. First, I'm going to give a little background on my study of this command. Then I'm going to get into some specifics of my recent research. I do expect that for some of you, you may initially feel some hesitation about this possibility, just as I did. So I wanted to address that also. Recently, I started researching essentially all of the vocabulary used in the commands of the Torah. Even if I felt like the contexts where each word was used were fairly clear, I still wanted to take the effort to look for further nuances to the meaning and for evidence in other Semitic languages. Whenever I was doing that, I came to Azkarah, the word often translated as memorial portion, which I will elaborate on in a little bit. This is what started my reevaluation of Exodus 23:13. I wasn't deliberately questioning my interpretation of that command. I didn't have any obvious ulterior motive on my mind in seeking to change my previous position on it. I was just going through researching the vocabulary of the commands one by one, and that process led to some new information, and I want to present that information to you for you to consider also. So I mentioned that I was looking at Azkarah, memorial portion. The reason that this matters for Exodus 23:13 is because Azkarah is related to the word in question in that verse, the causative form of Zachar. So Azkarah is related to Zachar. While I was studying this, I noticed that some scholars had asserted that Azkarah may refer to an invocation portion or an invocation offering, an offering which is used to invoke or call upon him. When I saw this, I was kind of puzzled and maybe a little frustrated about it because I had seen these kinds of claims before, at least with Zachar, claiming that forms of the word Zachar can mean invoke. But I never felt like conclusive evidence was provided. The kinds of examples that were provided were never satisfactory to me. There are a couple of times in the latter parts of the Tanakh that some scholars will cite and will say that in this verse, this is an example of a form of Zachar being used as invoke. But I saw a problem with that. The problem is that Zachar is clearly used as mention or remind in certain passages. It definitively carries those meanings, at least in some cases. Additionally, the word mention and the word invoke are similar enough that it can be hard to discern between them. So one example will be cited that refers to the name, either the name being invoked or the name being mentioned, and one scholar may simply say, this is an example of it meaning invoke, but the context is not clear. Those examples were never satisfactory to me because most of them could have used the translation of mention instead of invoke and still made sense with the context that we have. The meaning of mention and invoke are close enough that it requires more evidence than just an assertion by one scholar that it could mean invoke, because I can easily see that the word does mean mention in other times it is used. So just because, obviously just because one scholar makes a claim, that's not necessarily good enough. Not all scholars agree, and I want to know that they have some basis for a claim. So this is why I rested on the interpretation of mention for so long. As some of you know, I put out a video where I presented evidence for viewing it as mention in this command. And this was the practice that I had sought to do in my own observance for almost 10 years prior to this. When I was doing the recent research and saw the claim again of Invoke, I thought to myself, why are they saying this? What is the basis for this? Is there something else to this that hasn't been presented? And I guess it kind of pushed me over a threshold such that I decided to delve into the issue again. I started trying to find other examples outside of the Torah and outside of the Tanakh, looking into examples in other Semitic languages to see if there was anything actually concrete out there, something that actually could be used as evidence for Invoke. So one path I took with the research was delving further into resources for other Semitic languages. The Hebrew language is not totally unique. There are a number of other languages in its family that it shares vocabulary with. Probably the majority of the words used in the Torah we can find similar words for in related languages. That doesn't mean that every word that appears in a similar language has all of the same meanings or the exact same nuance to it as it does in the other language. But we can often see connections between these languages with the vocabulary. And it is not uncommon for the meaning of certain words in Hebrew to be arrived at through those connections. So in some cases, for example, we may see a Hebrew word which is, kind of close to another word in another language. It may be spelled slightly differently, or it might sound slightly different. But we can see that it's used in a similar way to the Hebrew word, and that it's close enough in its spelling or sound that there is probably some kind of connection. But in other cases, we can see a Hebrew word that is practically identical to a word in another Semitic language. So, depending on the script, it may be spelled exactly the same, or it might sound nearly the same. And we can see it used in the same ways, even down to the phrases that it appears in sometimes. So the word may appear in the same kinds of phrases that we see in the Hebrew. And one example of this is the phrase translated as making days long or making you live long in a looser translation. This is a phrase that appears a number of times in the Torah, and it also appears in a similar language with words of similar origin. That language's version of those Hebrew words used in the same kinds of phrases. So this is something that goes on with a large number of words in the Torah. And in this case, I also found that in reference to Zacher in Exodus 23:13. I delved into some Akkadian language resources. You can find most of the information I will cite in the Assyrian Dictionary of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. The word comparable to the Hebrew Zacher is Zacher or Zacheru. You can probably notice there's an obvious similarity there. And when I first started looking into this word, I saw a lot of similar examples to what I saw in Hebrew. But one thing that I noticed was a phrase in their language consisting of an equivalent of the word Zacher and an equivalent of the word Shem. We see both of these in the command of Exodus 23:13. So there is a combination of words that appears both in their language and in Exodus 23:13. First, I saw an example of this phrase in their language in a list of ways of worshiping their Elohim. The list included prayers, prostrations, and the equivalent of Zacher Shem. So an Elohim is being worshipped through prayer, through prostration, and apparently through this act described in Exodus 23:13. It at least uses comparable words for what is translated as mention name or invoke or call upon name, depending on how we've looked at it. Now, this got me kind of curious because, even though I didn't find that example to be a conclusive example by itself, I did feel like the context of worshiping an Elohim, of praying to an Elohim, and of prostrating to an Elohim implied a meaning closer to invoking or calling upon the name rather than simply mentioning the name. In the context of worship, mention didn't seem to carry the right meaning of what would be going on in that context. Now, as I said, that example alone did not totally convince me. Now, there were also a number of other examples that were maybe kind of similar to that, maybe close to that level of evidence in my view, but were not really conclusive, just like some of the examples that appear in the Tanakh. However, I did end up finding an example that I feel is unreasonable to argue against. And I feel like mention could not work as a translation for it, that the only viable translation is invoke or call upon. Now, this may seem kind of weird, but the example I found in that other language was a reference to a supposedly magical object. In the context, it was describing a device being used against demons. And it said that the object results in the invoking of the name of an Elohim. The object results in calling upon the name of an Elohim. So if an Elohim is invoked as a result of an object, mention would not fit as a translation. For what reason would an object be able to result in the mention of a name? If the object is a ritual device to supposedly draw upon the power of some Elohim in order to cast out demons, then invoke or call upon is a much better fit. This is an example that uses a similar set of words to what we see in Exodus 23:13. We see the comparable word to Shem and the comparable word to Zacher, and that phrase is used as invoke. This is the kind of evidence I had been looking for before, an example where it was clear that invoke was the only one of the two that could make sense. There were a number of examples before, such as in some of the verses in the Tanakh, where, maybe it meant invoke, but mention was not comfortably ruled out as a possibility. But in my view, this example demonstrates invoke as a potential meaning for Zacher, especially in that context which we see in Exodus 23:13. In further support of this, I want to point out some passages in the Tanakh which use the same word as Exodus 23:13 and also appear to carry the meaning of invoke or call upon. 1 Chronicles 16:4. The Levites, one's ministering, and to call upon, and to profess, and to praise. Here's an example similar to what I described before, listing practices of worship. The Levites are ministering, professing or acclaiming him, and praising him. Calling upon would seem to be a good fit for the word we are speaking of. Psalm 20, 7-10. Now I know that Yahuwah saves his anointed. He shall answer from the skies of his holiness, in mighty salvation of his right hand. These in chariot, and these in horses, and we in the name of Yahuwah our Elohim, we are calling upon. Save Yahuwah. The King will answer us in the day of our calling. The context of this passage is being saved in the day of trouble, and it references people relying upon chariots and horses, whereas we call upon or invoke his name. It then requests that he save, and it says that the king will answer when we call. Mention is not a good fit for the word in this case either. However, invoke or call upon fits the context very well. Psalm 38. Psalm to David, to call upon. That for you, Yahuwah, I await. You shall answer, my Lord, my Elohim. Let you not leave me, Yahuwah, my Elohim. Let you not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation. This example is similar to the last one, and the introduction to the psalm tells us it is about calling upon. That is the use of the same word we've been discussing. And as you can see, that is a very good fit for the context of this passage. It makes a lot of sense to introduce the psalm as one which is for calling upon him. Psalm 70, 1 through 2. To David, to call upon. Elohim, to deliver me. Yahuwah, to help me. Hurry. Here's another like the previous, requesting his help and his deliverance, requesting that he act. That fits very well with the translation of invoke or call upon. Using the translation of mention and saying that this psalm is to mention strikes me as quite insufficient and inappropriate for the context, especially knowing what we know about this word now. So I want to reiterate that going into this, I was not looking to change my view on Exodus 23:13. There wasn't any conscious ulterior motive driving me. I had been seeking to observe Exodus 23:13 as not mentioning the names of other Elohim for many years before this. In continuing to research and continuing to try to seek out what he really commands, regardless of what may have seemed right before, this is the evidence that I came across, and I try to be open to what the evidence suggests. When I came to this new information, I kind of sat on it for a while and let it process in the back of my mind for a time before eventually coming to a decision on it. Because it was something that I had interpreted and observed a certain way for so long, there was definitely part of me that initially resisted the information. Now, even though part of me could see the new evidence and think about it logically, there were feelings that would come up and cause me to feel nervous about it or to feel cautious about it. Even though I felt like the evidence was conclusive that the phrase can mean invoke, I wasn't ready to just jump into that immediately, and I think that this is an appropriate approach. It makes sense to be cautious about it. If there was something that we understood to be wrong and that we understood as a thing to avoid in the past, that means that we have a reason to hesitate. Now, hesitating does not mean rejecting. Hesitating does not mean ignoring or avoiding. We can feel hesitant, and we can recognize that feeling as a cue to be cautious, while at the same time mulling it over, thinking about it, looking into it, and actively seeking to incorporate the new evidence into our understanding and into our practice. Now, one thing that may come up with these feelings is the idea that Elohim can be behind certain kinds of feelings. While I believe that Elohim may communicate directly with people at times, even in ways that may resemble that, we should also recognize that we were given the Torah for a reason. We are not expected to just go off of feelings to tell us what is good and right in His sight. So instead, we are expected to rely on the wordings of the commands He gave. So feelings can serve a useful purpose, but a feeling alone does not always give us all of the information that we need. If we've really been in the habit of observing a command a certain way, it makes sense that it could be a part of us that's coming up and making us feel like, hey, let's be cautious. So if we have something like that, I think we should honor that while being open to the possibility of coming to a new conclusion if the wording of a command supports it. Another thing that I wanted to mention briefly, apart from feelings, is the reason or the meaning behind commands. So this is something that I've talked about in other videos at length, such as the video on reasons for commands, which you can see the video on the list of rememberthecommands.com. Essentially, there is this temptation to try to come up with reasons for why a command is supposed to exist, or otherwise to seek out the reasons behind a command. You know, this makes a lot of sense. It satisfies some part of us that wants to know why. And if our assumption is correct regarding that reason why the command was given, it could help us to better understand how to apply a command. If we know why a command is given, that can guide us on how we should do the command. But the problem is, if the reason for that command is not actually explained in the Torah, then it might not be right. There are very few commands that actually explain the reason why we are doing them. Going back to this issue of mention versus invoke, one might ask, why would you need to say the names of other Elohim at all? Why would you want to talk about it at all, or mention them at all? And that makes sense in a certain light. Or someone might say, it makes sense that he wouldn't want us to mention their names because insert reason here. And that may seem like a reasonable conclusion or a reasonable justification for that certain view. But the fact is that regardless of whatever interpretation we take on an issue, a person can always come up with a reason for it. Someone can always come up with a reason why that makes sense to them. Whether we think that we know the real reason behind a command or not, if it's not in the text, it may not be according to the text. If it's not in the text, it may not be according to the text. We want to rely more on the wordings of the commands than the concepts that we had arrived at in the past. So I wanted to mention that alongside the issue of feelings, because it is something that can come up when we reassess commands. So I'm not advocating that we go out and focus on talking about other Elohim, or to seek to preserve the memory of them, or anything like that. I don't have an interest in that. But regardless of whether we personally intend to do something or not, we have to make a distinction. The fact is, when we are considering the translation of invoke as opposed to mention, there are problems with understanding the command as mention. Now, I don't mean that in reference to it being inconvenient or anything like that. I never felt like that was actually any legitimate reason to interpret the command some other way. Convenience is very subjective. It doesn't determine right and wrong by the standard of the commands. But with regard to Exodus 23:13 and interpreting it as mention, there are some things to be aware of. In Hebrew, there are a number of words used in the normal vocabulary of the Torah, which are also names of other Elohim. The Hebrew words for the sun, the moon, the land, etc., those are actually names of other Elohim. Now, those words are not used as names of other Elohim or Elohim in the text, but that could still be relevant to someone who had understood the command to mean mention. Something else to be aware of is that other Elohim are mentioned or are referenced or are alluded to by their name or their title in the text. This goes beyond certain place names, for example, that are the names of different Elohim, place names that are used in the narrative of the text. A clear example of that is in Numbers 32:38. which refers to cities that were conquered by the sons of Israel, and the names of the cities were changed afterward because of that. Those sorts of things could kind of be debated, that maybe there's a hypothetical manuscript that doesn't say that, or maybe it doesn't use those names for those cities, or maybe it's an issue of it being the narrative of the text rather than the commands, or being the quotation of Elohim. But the fact is that the commands themselves and the quotations that are coming from Elohim at times also have these kinds of mentions and the direct mentions of names in reference to other Elohim, such as the beginning of Leviticus 20, among others. These things would inevitably be said during the commanded 7-year public reading of the Torah. These are problems which are hard to reconcile with any manuscript that we have, if we hold the interpretation of mention. And remember that we do have evidence that the word can mean invoke. Since we have evidence, invoke does fit much more cleanly. So how I would translate Exodus 23:13 is, "And you shall be guarding all which I say to you, and you shall not invoke the name of other Elohim. It shall not be heard on your mouth." So in a practical sense, most of us are probably not inclined to invoke the name of other Elohim. Nevertheless, I thought I would bring up some examples of the practice. Sometimes people will kind of cry out the name of an Elohim as a sort of profanity. And obviously, if they're doing that, rarely is it any sort of serious invocation. But something I saw in the research, and something that's arguably in the latter parts of the Tanakh also, is that the phrase can still describe an insincere calling upon of an Elohim. So that could be problematic, even though people would consider it a profanity. So that may be relevant to a few people. There are also songs that are sung to other Elohim using their names, or that invoke the name of other Elohim. So that's another thing that may be relevant. Regardless of whether it is serious or whether it is in jest, this is something that we should beware. And even if most of us do not need to make changes to our day-to-day life to observe this command, we still need to be mindful of it. And we still need to seek to understand, to guard, and to obey it.